And we are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn-free, civilly disobedient media, broadcasting live on the worldwide Coalition Media Network here at the Go Local Live Broadcast Center, deep in the heart of the city we love, Providence, Rhode Island. The naked city, the city of, well, a few 100,000 stories. We're telling a few tonight, both locally, and now we've gone down to our southwestern border. Facebook.com/The Coalition Radio, on the mighty Twitter at the Coalition_radio, and of course, Facebook.com/Coalition Radio and CoalitionRadio.us, the mothership, where links to our podcast page, our Liberty News page, where we're collating and presenting releases from Liberty organizations from around the country, including but not limited to the American Civil Liberties Union, and of course links to our YouTube page and our podcast page. We appreciate the folks who have taken time over the last few weeks to like and to follow us on social media. As always, for a startup podcast / video news program, somehow swimming through the white noise that is America's media today and presenting guests like our upcoming guest takes time and it takes resources. Simply liking and sharing our posts is an easy and simple way to spread the word that outrage porn does not have to be the rule of all media. The last time I spent quality time with our current guest was at a Denny's at about 2 o'clock in the morning. What started out as a conversation turned into what back in the day what they would have called an old-fashioned bull session, part of which we commemorated the tape, and you can find it here on the Coalition Radio, and part of it we just held off screen as we sat over a variety of caffeinated products and talked about some of the issues facing folks in New Mexico, Central, and Latin America. Our commitment to the region is quite simple. Having been blessed with the opportunity to travel down to the border and see firsthand at least a glimpse of what life is like across the border, attempting to travel by any means necessary into the United States, by having been blessed by spending quality time with a variety of humanitarian aid volunteers who have chosen to greet an international crisis with love and with compassion, and having met now a variety of the folks, including my current guests amongst the community, it is to try and accurately report what's actually happening on our southwestern border, as opposed to the sort of nonsense and pablum we're being spoon-fed, well, by all of the media, who are very much interested in short, quick sound bites and outrage porn and angry people and generalizations and cliches. We don't go there on the Coalition. So it is with deep gratitude and joy that I re-welcome our guest, Professor Andy Hernandez, who is now afforded officially frequent offender status on the Coalition, back here to our airwaves. Andy, it's great to have you on again. Thank you so much for joining me on a Friday night.
Delighted to be here tonight, Pat.
We marveled when we met in person, just sort of, I guess back in the day in the 50s they would have called it how you're sitting in the catbird seat. And an old-timey cliche, but here you find yourself an accomplished academic, not only in terms of research, but in teaching and working with young people. You find yourself literally, not on a sideline, but literally on the field of one of the most challenging moments, I believe, in recent American history, as we try to assess, determine, prognosticate, sometimes just figure the hell out, what we're doing here with our neighbors in Latin and Central America. For folks who didn't have an opportunity, Professor Andy Hernandez is in residence at Western New Mexico University. And I love this because we're going to talk about the courses in a second. He's got his MBA from Western New Mexico University, a PhD in history from the University of New Mexico, a master's in history from New Mexico State University, and a bachelor's in history from TCU, Texas Christian University. Listen to this coursework, and you'll understand why we're happy to announce it. And he's going to join us from time to time, hopefully on a monthly basis, as his time allows, to bring us up to speed from his real-world perspective, mixed in with a healthy dose of that knowledge thing, why we're so thrilled to talk to him. His coursework includes inter-American relations, 20th century revolutions, drug wars, Revolution and Civil War in Latin America, Colonialism, Slavery, Central America, Religion in Latin America, Modern Latin America, Colonial Latin America, the Mexican Revolution, Christianity and the Roman Empire, and World Civilization. I think you covered everything there, Chief. Tell us about, if you will, give us a little background. First of all, how did you find yourself in academia, and how did you find yourself immersed in simultaneously a wide array of subjects, but oddly enough, all uniquely honed in on the issues surrounding one region so intensively?
All right, Pat. So, when I talk to students now, I kind of think of myself as a bit of a cautionary tale because people frequently remark that you change your major several times when you're going through your bachelor's coursework. History was actually the third major that I chose. I didn't actually pick it until senior summer. And it's probably because I wasn't paying close enough attention to what I was actually enjoying, because I was a math major, but I was still taking courses on Europe and Napoleon. And I was a political science major, but I was still taking courses on the history of Latin America. And so I actually, even though I didn't choose my major till late, I still managed to graduate in 4 years. So I was quite pleased with that. My family was as well, for obvious reasons. But those courses really kindled the interest for me to continue on with master's and doctorate work at Mexico State and University of New Mexico. They have such excellent programs focusing on Latin American history that those were obvious choices for me. And as you mentioned, basically all of these courses really dovetail in, the majority of these courses really hone in on similar material overall. I think the challenge is, and some of my students are always surprised, even though the material overlaps considerably, we don't reuse the same books or the same articles. So by the time they're done, they have a very thorough reading of material, not the simple reuse of stuff over several courses.
We spoke at length last time, and I do want to go over some of the same territory again, but I want to focus when you come on some of the current events. What, from your interpretation, and again, sitting and living in a border town that's literally 33 miles from the Mexican border, a little town called Palomas, Mexico, a couple of checkpoints and some pretty tough-looking desert away. What's your perspective on the status of the border right now? How would you talk about the political temperature there and the humanitarian temperature?
Well, for the moment, things are relatively quiet, but I don't think that's something that's going to last. And so when you came out last month, you had a chance to visit the migrant shelter and such. That was basically, you were coming in as things were tapering off after about a year and a half of intensified immigration and number of asylum seekers coming across and number of shelters opening up in this region. But I think one of the interesting things is to take a look at the broader border and see how, let's take El Paso, for example. That's only an hour and a half drive from where I am. Things had intensified there quite a bit before they actually did here as well. I think this was a sign of people trying to enter at broader points as El Paso was filling up, as shelters were filling up there, as some of the ones in Southern California were filling up. So naturally, we watch those larger areas too to see when things might intensify here once again. And so far, they haven't.
This week's announcement, and actually let's step back a little bit, and I'm going to ask you possibly one of the broadest audio-video questions of all time. How did we get here? I mean, give us, if you will, a little backdrop to the tensions that have led to a mass migration, not just from Mexico, but literally a good part of Central America and even now parts of Latin America. What are the precipitative causes from your perspective?
You have several different things that are coming together right now. The crisis in Venezuela obviously is one that continues to intensify. Nicaragua is the area that I've studied the most closely, and it's not that things have improved there, that there is a momentary lull in political violence over the last several months. lull probably is a disservice to the people who are living there. It's much less intense right now than it was in, say, April of 2018 when there were mass demonstrations against the government and widespread repression over the summer. I think that will ignite again in the relatively near future. I'm reasonably certain. And then you have places that have been in an ongoing state of distress, Guatemala and Honduras and El Salvador especially, that I think contributed quite a bit towards the decision that we saw this week and the policies that drove that.
So, how much of this, and this is where what we try to do is be our own little version of political mythbusters here. How much of that is a function of economic issues? How much of that is a function of the drug war? And how much of that is, well, let's just say indirectly impacted by American interference in local governments over the years?
If you look at Central America, we're still living through the legacy from the 80s. Perhaps even if intervention had stopped there, things might have had the opportunity to calm down over the long term. But I think, as I mentioned last time, the United States was still taking sides in the Honduran coup of 2009. Canada actually preempted us and recognized the government, the coup government there before the United States did. So you have more powers also taking an interest in the region. I think part of it, though, is that, you mentioned this a bit when you talk about the noise chamber that sometimes our understanding of these events takes on it from time to time. I take a look at how much migration just hasn't been demonized, but how much it's been magnified here. Because if we take a place like Venezuela, over the last year and a half, there have been 4 million Venezuelans fleeing their country. Only about a little under 300,000 of those in the United States. Overwhelmingly, these are folks who have chosen to migrate to bordering countries and either seek some sort of visa or seek asylum there. So, 300,000 out of a total population of 4 million fleeing. We're not even looking at 10% of the folks who have ended up only 10% of them have ended up in the United States. Colombia, by comparison, has taken on 1.3 million. Peru's taken on almost 800,000. So if you were to, I think even for Americans at varying levels of education on this issue would still think that we're receiving the overwhelming percentage of those migrants, and we just aren't.
America likes to think of itself as having a long-standing history in welcoming folks from a variety of crises. How much of that is true, and how much of that really is conflating American relief efforts, which are actually typically brought to the nation? Are we very good at absorbing migrants, absorbing people from natural and political disasters in reality?
Well, I think the biggest stain on the American national honor still is the SS St. Louis, the refugee ship from Europe in the 1930s that brought primarily women and children to the United States, and they were turned around.
Right.
And so, people quibble over how many of those ended up in Hitler's death camps, and really all that you can say about the ones who weren't is that they ended up in places like Mexico and Great Britain where they were out of Hitler's reach. The folks who had to return to France and Belgium, they were largely rounded up and put into the death camps. So, if ever there were a moment that called for charity and clarity for what it means to accept migrants, you would think that would have been it. And of course, we did not accept those folks with open arms.
Right. And
the United States has at various points been very welcoming to people who are fleeing disasters. I can't say that right now, though, when you take a look at the confusion over letting Bahamians in after Hurricane Dorian. We have at various points been a bit less welcoming when it's come to trying to take a closer look and ask if somebody's an economic migrant or if they're seeking political asylum or if it's with violence, and that kind of neglects how those causes interact. Because, to go back to our conversations about the interconnections between these things, if a person flees gang violence in Honduras, gangs are fueled by drug trafficking in that part of the world. And what they're primarily doing is they're delivering, they're part of a network that's delivering illegal drugs to the United States. So you have demand for, looking beyond foreign policy now even, you have the economic demand in the United States for these drugs that doesn't really show any sign of tapering off. But that's still fueling political violence and gang activity in parts of Central America.
We're now being greeted with tales of folks who have been attempted to go through the process, the refugee process, the political asylum process, who in fact have been turned down and returned back to their country, where they've actually met the fate that they were so afraid of. They've been killed. You know, do you get the sense that there's any remorse anywhere in the American public, or are we just, you know, kind of shuffling our feet and looking in the other direction in an awkward silence and just trying to wish it all away?
You know, I think that if you talk with Americans individually or even in groups, I haven't seen polling data on this recently. I think if you talk about somebody who is tangibly fleeing violence, when it's obvious, there's quite a bit of sympathy for it. Mm-hmm. But I think it's also easy sometimes. I think where the water's muddy for the general public is sometimes it's easy to muddy what constitutes violence that they're fleeing, and just the assumption that people are coming here for free things seems to be one of the ugliest manifestations of not understanding some of the broader context of what's going on here. And I think part of what also gets obscured here is just how many, you know, I mentioned the number of migrants, number of asylum cases that other countries in the hemisphere are taking. There are some cases where even Mexico has a better acceptance rate of asylum seekers from other countries than the United States does. But if you take a look at the idea that migrants should be applying for asylum in Mexico, it's driven by this assumption that they aren't already asking for it there, or that they're not asking for it in Costa Rica if they're fleeing Nicaragua, or they're not asking for it in Peru if they're fleeing from Venezuela.
Mm-hmm. You live right on the border. And it struck me in the few days that I spent there and the conversations I've had before, during, and after, that, and again, I'm Captain Obvious here, the border simultaneously is an integral part of folks' life, yet at the same time, very often, life goes on as if the border weren't there. What are individual Americans' perspective who live on the border on this humanitarian crisis? How do they feel? Is it mixed emotions? Is it torn? Or do you have an outpouring of support because so much of the culture there is Latin American? What are folks thinking?
You still have those mixed emotions. So I'm grateful that the community had quite a bit of positive coverage from major news outlets. This is one of the things that attracted you to come out here as well and take a look. There are so many people that work together to be able to take in the number of asylum seekers who were crossing in the last several months into this part of the United States. You do still have some sectors, though, in this county and in this city where there's resentment of those asylum seekers. And I think probably one of the most glaring things that caught my eye is that so many people didn't understand that the folks who had been cleared by Homeland Security, whether it was generally the Border Patrol, occasionally ICE, that essentially these were people whose criminal history had been checked. These were people who had sponsors in the United States, which meant that they would even have work permits in the United States on most occasions. They generally weren't people who were going to stay here. I'm not aware of very many cases where people did, just because this is also the county with the highest unemployment in New Mexico. So I think that more and more people began to realize that we were a waypoint for people who were going on to something else. But that took a little time in and of itself, too.
How many folks in your community, not only for numbers, but more of a philosophically, how many folks in your community actively go back and forth over the border? Is it a significant amount? I know that folks from Mexico are educated in the Deming, New Mexico public school system, or other neighboring towns. What is life like? Do folks have significant family presence on both sides? Are folks working and employed, going back and forth across the border on a daily basis?
Well, let's just take a look for a moment at people crossing from this community into, say, Palomas. People will go for a meal, they will go for eyeglasses, or they'll go for dental work, or they will go to get their prescriptions filled, that sort of thing, or some combination of all of those. So, on any given day, you can go to one of the restaurants over there and find people you recognize, just in terms of people that cross from Deming to Palomas. There are people who go quite a bit deeper into the interior, though. Copper Canyon is a very popular tourist spot. There's also quite a bit of travel to Rocky Point into Mexico's coast to enjoy the beach out there too. So you've got significant numbers of Americans who are enjoying Mexico. You do have students who will cross in the K-12 system. Really, in most of the university systems in the United States, these are citizens. This is something that was felt pretty keenly when I noticed, this was writ large with UTEP, the University of Texas at El Paso, that you had students who were U.S. citizens living in Ciudad Juarez who would cross each day to go to school. But as the border crossings became increasingly congested, you had a case where those students were held for increasing numbers of hours, and it was difficult for them to make classes. There were also some employees who crossed daily in that area. To look at this community again specifically, every day, very early in the morning, the students who are U.S. citizens will line up and be processed at the port of entry, and they will get onto buses and they will travel into Columbus Elementary or into one of the middle or high schools. So that happens on a daily basis out here as well.
So to a large degree, we make out here in the rest of the country a much bigger deal with the border than folks who, actually live on the border. Is that an overstatement?
I don't think it's an overstatement necessarily, because there are a lot of things that people deeper in the interior of the United States miss. Like you mentioned checkpoints. That's something that surprises a lot of people, right? That the United States has internal checkpoints distributed all throughout, not just the southern border, but the northern border as well, coastal regions also.
Yeah,
but it's something that you really don't get until you drive through one of those.
Right. I mean, in driving from Palomas to Albuquerque, including the border, we went through two checkpoints on the American side, including one that was literally just outside of Albuquerque, and an entire interstate was redirected through the checkpoint. So this was not a casual exercise. This was, and folks who look at the geography, Albuquerque is about 3 hours north of the Mexican border. So you're well into the country at that point in time. This is not some, dusty little border town. Albuquerque is a major city along the lines of a Providence or a Boston. So it's in that respect, it's very much part of the Americans' lives. So let's talk about, if we can, drill down a little detail, and then I want to talk about the events of this week. You've studied extensively El Salvador, primarily, but also a number of other countries. Where right now, and we all know about Venezuela. I mean, Venezuela is a country, I believe, right now that's being hijacked for a lot of information and misinformational political purposes in this country. Everyone's got their own Venezuela paradigm, their own Venezuela fable to match their own political belief system. So in that respect, in Venezuela, these people who are in these terrible conditions, their fate is being used largely anecdotally here in the country, while at the same time I'm not sure what we're doing to help the situation. Talk to us about the other countries, particularly the Central American countries, because I'm not sure if people are as aware of the challenges facing Nicaragua as well as Costa Rica and other bordering Mexican independent states. What's going on in some of these countries?
Probably the of them individually. Take Guatemala. There are 6 Guatemalans seeking asylum in the United States or just trying to migrate. I mean, Guatemala was a country that in the 80s had an internationally recognized genocide against Mayan Indians as part of its civil war. So, you had a few 100,000 Indians, Mayan Indian population of the various Mayan Indian populations who were slaughtered as part of the violence of that period. It's been very difficult in that country for people to get justice. And you have a similar pattern in the civil wars in several of the other countries in Central America as well, where initially in the early 90s, mid-90s, there were amnesty laws protecting anybody who might have been involved in the violence. It was very difficult to prosecute. By the early 2000s, you begin to see a handful of prosecutions. There were a few that were also part of the Anti-Corruption Commission that operated in Guatemala until very recently. But this is an example of a non-military intervention. The United States had a hand in encouraging the cancellation of the Corruption Commission in the past several months in Guatemala. And so you had a commission that was actually a very good expenditure of foreign aid from all over the world, by the way, not just from the United States, and operated under the auspices of the UN. But the commission's work is then undone as the Guatemalan government turned against it very recently. And so the very limited opportunity that the gains that have been made against corruption in finding justice for past violence, all of those are being undone. El Salvador is a particularly notable example because that's another country that is now looking at reinstituting amnesty for the war crimes of the civil wars of the 1970s and 80s. And you have a really unholy alliance operating there because some former members of the FMLN are working with the army to support the idea of canceling out any type potential for them to be prosecuted, even now decades later, for these crimes. And in Nicaragua, where I've looked most closely, essentially you have a government there. The Ortega government, Ortega returned to power 2008, I believe, and has been in power ever since, and has very quickly moved to enrich a few close supporters and member of his family and try to make sure that he's going to have a hold on power as long as he can.
Wow.
The violence exploded there in April of 2018 was largely tied to some of the autocratic measures that he had taken. The most recent one was an attempt to roll back Social Security protections.
So let's take those 3 countries, if you will, and isolate each one. Because, folks are most familiar with Nicaragua, if not because of a certain rock album that came out, I think, sadly. They're familiar with Ortega. They're familiar with the Sandinistas. But let's take Guatemala. Here you have, if anyone has ever worked alongside of, and I've had the pleasure a number of times of working beside folks from Guatemala, and again, not to be Pollyannish here, but as a people, as a culture, they are some of the loveliest people that I've ever met. They're some of the hardest working people I've ever met. Their family structures are sacred, and they've managed to survive, in a sense, a forced migration and tragedies that would destroy most nations and cultures. But what was it that precipitated? Was there a single unifying issue in each of these countries that precipitated this type of violent civil war?
Guatemala is kind of a case that stands out because that was the second major operation that the CIA undertook to overthrow a government. The first, of course, was Iran in 1953. The following year, there was a government that was that many of President Eisenhower's advisors thought was closely aligned with communists, and a lot of that perception was driven by executives from the United Fruit Company who were whose land was threatened. Their land was threatened, by the way, because in kind of that ultimate so common scheme, they had been paying taxes on only a fraction of the value of their land, and the new government in Guatemala wanted to tax them on a much more realistic valuation of what their land was. So, socialism and communism are often ill-defined. In the case of Guatemala in the 1950s, communism in too many circles meant that foreign companies were going to be taxed on something closer to the fair value of their land. And we might shake our heads at that now. The reality is that the government was overthrown, and the military rose to power, and at times held power explicitly, at times just decided who would ultimately hold power in the country on kind of with their support. And so that was the driving event, the driving Cold War event in Guatemala that led to the violence of the 70s and 80s, and then we're still seeing some of the effects of that violence today.
Now, the Honduras, what situation do they find themselves in right now? What's the temperature there like, and what were some of the precipitative reasons for, if you will, the cultural or socio-cultural chaos that's occurring there?
The biggest thing that's hurting Honduras right now would be the degree to which the government is destabilized by gang activity. And so you have this outright instance of corruption, of course, when there are payoffs or open collaboration between members of the government at lower levels and gangs themselves. And so, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of this is tied into the drug wars. Of course, it's also tied into other things like human trafficking. But ultimately, you have Honduras did not face the type of revolutionary movement that, say, Guatemala or El Salvador did in the 1970s and 80s. But to some degree, that was the case because the U.S. So closely supported the government and maintained such a large military presence. There were policy advisors in the 70s and 80s that openly joked that that Honduras was the best aircraft carrier in the U.S. fleet.
So we're 0-2 then so far in nations where there's been direct American meddling through both underground and overt foreign policy issues, as well as a healthy dash of corporate cronyism, because, you'd have to be of a certain age to remember the United Fruit Company, but, there's a reason why we only get one form of bananas, and there's a reason why there's only certain produce is generated in the United States, and that's largely your United Fruit Company. Folks, look it up. It's a terrible moment in quote unquote American history where we again continue to export violence. Now, Costa Rica.
And so,
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
And so that's very true. While the U.S. has had a singular influence in the area, though, I do want to keep in mind that, for example, the violence of the 70s and 80s was epical, but it was not the only thing going on here. So in Honduras in 2009, it did take, other powers being involved. The Canadian government, like I mentioned, we stereotype Canadians as being utterly inoffensive and overly polite, but they are a country that has national interests of its own. And it was in the national interests of Canada to be the first to recognize the post-coup government in 2009, which has directly led to the current conditions in Honduras.
Okay. Costa Rica.
Costa Rica is, in American history, we like to describe many people like to describe the United States as exceptional. When you study Central America, Costa Rica is presented as an exceptional case as well. It's a country that has had a remarkable level of stability, and frequently the defining moment there seems to be that in the wake of World War II, Costa Rica abolished its military. There's actually now just the Fuerza Pública, basically a national police force that's responsible for protecting the nation. Sometimes perhaps we might make a little too much of that because police, of course, in most of the world have become increasingly militarized over the last several decades. And I certainly don't want to leave anybody under a misimpression here because the Costa Rican police force trains with American special forces at various bases in the United States. So I don't, to Costa Rica's credit, they do not spend the amount of money on armed forces that other countries do as a part of their per capita income. It shows in their infrastructure and in their social safety net and that sort of thing. But I don't want to leave folks under the wrong impression about the National Police Force because it is a credible force.
Now, you've got the well-documented CIA university that was created in effect to train, if you will, a number of the members of respective juntas down there. And that was, of course, one of the favorite picketing points of American leftists for a generation. And I think, what did they call that? The University of the Americas, or what is that?
School of the Americas.
School of the Americas, right? Is that still a force in supporting Central American regimes? Do we still put advisors, and I'm using the coalition air quotes of the term advisor, are advisors still a tool employed by the United States in Central or Latin America?
To some degree they are, but the line blurs here because, let's take the United States military is exceptionally well trained. It shouldn't come as a surprise then that other governments like to do joint exercises and send their forces here for training as well. That shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody. But the School of America seems to have been an especially dark example of that. There are a disproportionate number of folks from Latin American militaries who went through the School of the Americas and then are tied to human rights abuses all through Latin America.
Right. Soccer stadiums, for example, being filled with them. By the way, I just did a quick Google. It's now called the Western Hemisphere Institute for Security Cooperation. Doesn't that make you feel better?
It is. It is. It's been rebranded. And
kind of like New Coke and Old Coke.
If this isn't the age of marketing, I don't know how to describe it otherwise, and it doesn't just impact what we buy. But, there was another headline this past week. ICE did an especially bad job of redacting the documents that went into procurement for the new urban warfare center that they're planning to open. Mm-hmm. And not to make this too terrifying, it looks like that one of those facilities was going to be near the present site of the reimagined School of the Americas.
Excellent. Well, you've got the facility, they've got the heritage. It's kind of like the Ivy Leagues of genocide, if you will. Ouch. You got your Harvard, your Yale, and if you're looking to put forward your own twisted version of a New World Order, you always have now, what should we call them? WHISC? Do they have like a mascot? Is there a football?
Not that I'm aware of.
Is there a football team?
I guess the thing is there have been sincere efforts to reform institutions like this. I think, to reinstill faith in them, I would just make sure that if I were, in charge, I would make sure that they weren't associated with anything questionable, like, say, an urban warfare center for ICE.
Wow. Well, let's then, that is chilling. That's absolutely chilling. The reimagining or the repurposing of an organization like that. We talk about reboots now of a variety of cultural phenomenons and films and things like that. I don't know if rebooting that is such a desirable cultural reinvigoration, if you will. Trump had some what were described loosely as victories, and to me, most of them, actually all of them, are appalling. Talk to me about, if you will, first of all, this whole discussion about where one has to apply for asylum and what the practical impact of that is.
So in the Trump administration, for example, and this has even happened under previous administrations, there have been a lot of accusations that other countries don't do their due diligence in trying to take in people who are fleeing troubled countries. And so, the Trump administration had a very public clash with Mexico over this a few months ago. And yet, the type of policy that is coming into place hinges on the fact that other countries are responsible. Because let's take a look at Colombia for a moment and the 1.3 million Venezuelans that they've accepted into their borders. If they were a country that was not sincerely committed to the human rights of those people, they could simply deny them visas and ship them en masse to the United States.
Right.
Because those folks will have met the qualifications, met the requirements under this executive order. They will have attempted to apply in a third country, in a, quote, safe third country, and will have been denied. So if, say, Colombia behaved as irresponsibly as other countries are imagined to in migration and asylum, they could unleash a damaging number of migrants on the United States. And I say damaging just in terms of sheer numbers. To go back again to the beginning of the conversation, the United States has had just under 300,000 Venezuelans in the last couple of years attempt to enter the United States, and out of a total of 4 million who have left the country and gone to other countries.
Right.
Nicaragua is another good example because the overwhelming majority of the people who have fled for their lives there fled into Costa Rica. And so if Costa Rica was a bad actor that did not have any commitment to human rights, they could simply deny asylum applications to all of these people and put them on a boat or a plane to the United States.
And this, by the way, isn't just shameful American behavior in this hemisphere, but one only needs to go back a handful of years to the human rights crisis, the atrocities that happened in Syria. Americans didn't exactly stand up for Syrian human rights, did they?
No, they did not, and that's an excellent example too, because the Trump administration certainly sucks a lot of oxygen out of the room right now. But the problems that we're facing right now, it's overly simplistic to blame them solely on one administration. These are longer-term trends in U.S. history that are certainly being exacerbated now, but not all of them were created recently. And so Syria is an excellent case there. Iraq is an excellent case.
And the mixed signals that the Obama administration and now the Trump administration send to people of Iran. I mean, we portray ourselves as that symbol of hope, yet our failure to really participate at any level in these humanitarian crises and our unwillingness to open our borders to, I think, largely people of goodwill is atrocious. How is it that Angela Merkel could find room in Germany, a country not exactly with a history of, as a melting pot, for lack of a better term, ouch. How is it that Angela Merkel, and she paid a political price for it, by the way, could open up Germany, and we couldn't see fit to even allow, in a dignified manner, returning academics from the Middle East to come into the United States? You're not just a student in history, you're a professor and an expert in history. Has this always been the American way? I mean, has it always this sort of hypocrisy where we speak to being a city on the hill, a nation on the hill, that gold standard, while at the same time essentially ignoring the refugee problem around the world, sometimes when it's of our own creation?
Well, I think one thing you can fairly say is that there aren't many periods in U.S. history overwhelming the U.S. has at best reluctantly accepted immigrants and sometimes at worst actively persecuted immigrants.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see that in all of the different nationalities that have immigrated to the U.S. over time, some of which are unapologetically recognized now as fundamental parts of American culture, and yet 150 years ago would not have been.
Right. So this week, our Supreme Court, and again, I'd love to have you, I'll just make a very generalized statement based on superficial analysis of the great unwashed here. This asylum ban that the Supreme Court is allowing to stand, while in fact there's legal challenges pending to it in lower courts, has essentially, by some accounts, allowed Trump to build his wall without, well, building a wall. Explain, if you will, exactly what's happened here and why, on a human rights level, this is so critical.
So, to a large degree, the Supreme Court punted on this and consistently said that they would allow the ban to stay in place while lower courts sorted things out. So even now, you don't have a definitive answer here. Mm-hmm. But the major threat that you do have is that there are, and let's take Venezuela and Nicaragua, for example. The United States has issued at various points travel advisories against these countries. It's not safe for Americans to go there. The United States has imposed sanctions against various members of the leadership of these countries. The United States is actively supporting the opposition leader in Venezuela, and yet the ban as it stands now has created circumstances where Venezuelans can be returned to that country, even though by any definition of a need for asylum, people fall into that and will most likely face significant violence, if not outright death, if they're forced to return home. Mm-hmm.
And that, by the way, let me jump in. That is
asylum seekers have actually been returned to Nicaragua in small numbers. Mm-hmm. Even though the United States has imposed sanctions on that government's leadership, even though we have at various points in the last year and a half, 2 years, have had travel warnings telling Americans it's not safe to go there. I don't know what else it would take to recognize that the country, that people would face violence if they're forced to return, and yet now put into the position where they could be forced to return.
And I just wanted to jump in. The fundamental litmus test, if you will, for seeking asylum is the clear, not just chance, the inevitability, if you will, of violence upon an individual is by definition, and again, my understanding, of why someone seeks asylum. When a nation state is ready to execute you, you have a human right to leave that country and to seek safer surroundings. Am I exaggerating that?
You are not exaggerating that, and it also feeds into it. I mean, there's another area here. I mean, naturally, as you might expect, I was just checking up on most recent events today before we went on the air, and a lot of times people perceive immigrants to be woefully uneducated. So if we take a look at Venezuela, for example, we have a country with enormous oil reserves, and we have a country where the most recent case that I was just that one of the newspapers had focused on this morning, there's a Venezuelan petroleum engineer who's attempting to get asylum in the United States, whose family has told him that the police have come looking for him, that the police have threatened to kill him if he returns. You have not only human rights at work here, but you have self-interest at work here. Why would the United States not take a trained oil engineer as a person who would make a valuable contribution? I look at this from the perspective of idealism and a commitment to human rights, but there's a tangible self-interest at work here as well that the United States is still not acting upon.
Right. Yeah, no, it's appalling. And again, we get back to my mantra, which is how many of these regimes who are perpetrating these, we'll call it, George Carlin would have a field day here, by the way, violations of human rights, which is a nice way of saying, murdering them. How many of these regimes have been either propped up directly by the government, American government, or indirectly by the seemingly insatiable appetite the American culture has for narcotics? And yet if I say blatantly we are the problem, and then I'm bashed as being anti-American and unpatriotic, and with no regard whatsoever for the American rule of law. Well, screw the American rule of law. People are dying. They're dying because of our government and our government's policies, directly and indirectly, sometimes both. So it just strikes me as the height of ignorance that folks who are knee-jerk defenders of the last two presidents with regard, and I say last two, not just the current one, the last two presidents, with their regard for their just ignorance of human rights, a pox on their house. A chilling, if you will, prediction was given to me by one of the folks in Deming. One of the folks in Deming, they went on camera with this. One of the organizers of the refugee center there actually had, before moving back to Deming, incredibly enough, had served with the nation's military in Italy at the height of the refugee crisis from Syria. And the fear is, quite frankly, by them, that bottling up refugees in lower Central America will, in fact, at some point force a seaborne, if you will, emigration that will make the boat lift from Cuba and the escape from Syria to countries like Italy and North Africa look like a walk in the park. I've seen firsthand now the desperation of individuals trying to get into the United States. My experience, as limited as it is that these folks are so desperate that they will put their lives at stake because they really have no other chance. They are jumping from the burning building. What do you fear, from your perspective, is the outcome of this newest attempt to essentially offshore our asylum system?
Well, I try not to say things like that out loud, but the case you just mentioned is a very real possibility. And we just don't have to put that much imagination into it. At various points under Fidel Castro, look at how many Cubans tried to cross on plywood, on planks. How many drowned trying to do that? How many got here and were returned? It just doesn't take much to understand that that's a distinct possibility for us in our future.
Mm-hmm. Particularly if it's through the Gulf of Mexico. If you have immigrants fleeing Mexico, first of all, it will be to a whole another region. So essentially, and again, I use these terms really to illustrate the point, not to be childish about it, but you'll very much have a border port of entry game of whack-a-mole going on here. You've already got it to a degree, where in the absence of for example, New Mexico was cited by some as having a paucity of border patrol resources, which may have been, in fact, one of the reasons why during this last refugee crisis, so many folks attempted entry in and around Palomas in that crossing. Is that a possibility where we're just going to see populations attempt to get to the United States with whatever has been portrayed as the available route du jour?
I think that's absolutely the case because, we describe it in unflattering terms as gaming the system. But the simple fact is that when there is a set of rules, people will look to see how they can fall under it, and they will look to see what the exceptions are. And when that doesn't work, they'll look to see what the gaps are. And, the people now frequently decry the number of families that are crossing, but the number of families that are crossing are a direct result of the previous decade, where single men were discouraged from coming. Substitute the word breadwinner for single men. These were people who were sending money home to support their families.
Right.
But as soon as that wasn't allowed anymore, yes, people started bringing their families. So no matter what the United States puts in place, no matter what any country puts in place, there are going to be things that we miss, just as a matter of designing policy. That's all but inevitable. And there will be people who will look to see if they can fall under an exception. There will be people who will work their way around it. And what I'm dancing around here, but I really just say it out loud. There is so much angst in the United States over illegal immigration. Folks who come here without visas are generally guilty of misdemeanors. And when we sit here and expand the coercive powers of the state to deal with misdemeanors with this kind of vigor, what's the next president going to do with that type of power? Or the president that follows that, or the president that follows that? Because I'm willing to be contradicted here, but I haven't seen in my lifetime a new president come in and say, that was really just a step too far. We shouldn't do that.
That's why you need to become elect libertarians, my friend. we ascribe to the highest levels of power, so we can leave everyone the hell alone. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. We talked. It's ironic because if you're old enough, you remember the conversations about the imperial presidency during the Nixon administration. Roll that forward now to undeclared wars / police actions in literally almost the entire globe, where we're going to drone the liberty into people. You're absolutely right. And yet Congress, when it comes time for fundraising, will yell and shout. But given the power, and now we've had 2 instances in the immediate years where both major political parties have controlled all 3 houses of government, if you will, all 3 branches of government, effectively, and they've done nothing to correct the crisis. Which leads me to my question of the night. We've been building up to this for a while. What would President Andy Hernandez do? What? You're there. You see the human cost. You live surrounded by the culture. You teach at a university. You act both in terms of, you work in terms of research, but you're also teaching young people, both academics and you're helping them along towards a career goal. So you live the life. What would you do?
The low-hanging fruit is that you have to immediately rework the asylum system. The ban that's in place now, it is a human rights catastrophe if we return people to Venezuela or Nicaragua. The United States doesn't have much of a coherent foreign policy at this moment, but a minimally coherent thing we could do is have our asylum practices align with the declarations that we've made about these countries. From there, it's time to take a really honest look also and expand asylum protections for people coming in from other parts of Central America. It's also necessary, ultimately, and there is beginning to be momentum here, it's time to take a new look at the war on drugs. Because the ongoing prohibition of some of these materials is costing so much money and is having such a direct impact, not just on our country, but on other countries. We take a look at even things that have fallen outside of the direct prohibition on drugs. And you just take a look at the opioid crisis right now. I mean, how many people are suffering from legally prescribed opioids? And we see a little bit of that working its way through the court system now as well, but it's time for a fundamental reexamination of the prohibition on various drugs as well. I would also say that it is long overdue. The Reagan administration was able to put through a path to citizenship for people who were here without papers. It's time to recognize that as well. It's it's something that you can only deny on an emotional level by feeling threatened by migrants. But at a time of full employment, at a time where the United States has fallen below the replacement rate on population, your only solution for that is to bring in more people. Because people are obviously, it is a long-term trend that people are not having as many babies as they used to.
Right.
And you take a look at how the overwhelming number of people who are trying to get into the country are hardworking, decent people. It's time to look at finding a place for them instead of demonizing them.
And I want to stress, these are people you live with. These are people you go to church with. These are people your family interacts with on a daily basis. You know, and have done so for I would imagine, a significant part of your lifetime.
Beyond my lifetime, I know that because I've looked at migration along the border at other periods as well.
The solution seems so simple, yet it's. I don't know if I've seen it further away than now, and the absence of any profiles and courage whatsoever, seemingly at every level of government, unfortunately reinforces that. I think your solutions are spot on. It makes economic sense. It's, you know, the free passage of individuals and the free exchange of ideas and commerce are fundamental human rights that cannot be abridged by anyone drawing a line on a border or on a map or in a law book or even a textbook. These are rights that we declare to ourselves to be natural born. And yet, as you pointed out so aptly tonight, we seem to feel as a culture that others are certainly not entitled to that. And the results are increasingly tragic. Well, it's funny, as I get older in life, I realize that there are fewer and fewer such things as coincidences. And things always happen for a reason. And it was just a couple of weeks ago that we, through just a referral from a local minister, introduced me to you, and I'm already grateful for that because, again, your friendship and the perspective you're offering is so badly needed up here. We've talked about you coming on the show from time. Actually, you have an open door. If you want to come on the show and you just want to vent, or if you have a particular point you'd like to make, just call. But what I'd love to do is have you on a routine basis and just give perspectives on all of these issues, because again, the incredible combination of both living it and studying it and researching it at the highest level, and that's the purpose of the show. We're just a little group of people trying to actually spread knowledge and information, and I appreciate already getting to know you and your contributions to our effort here. So, God bless, Andy Hernandez. Thank you for joining us tonight.
You as well, Pat. It is a delight to be on your show, and I'm looking forward to doing it again.
All right, wait. Somehow I think, as the winds of political change occur seemingly on a daily basis here, I think you and I are going to be talking to each other pretty often, as they say. I don't, with an election ongoing and a president desperate to solidify his base against the seemingly increasing polls that are not in his favor, combine that with a confused message from a Democratic Party that at least preaches to be the party of social righteousness and fairness and equity and human rights. The absence of any message, and the notion that at least a handful of the potential nominees are, maybe not in rhetoric, but worse yet, in actual practice in their political careers, have been Trumpian in their own unique way. Combine a district attorney from a city that openly works hard to incarcerate people for low-level drug offenses. Throw in a former vice president who is, in his own way, guilty of contributing to some of the most egregious political and civil rights offenses in American history, versus a president who stands by himself in terms of his attitude. I don't know, Chief. It ain't looking good. So if you hear of anybody or any good news on the horizon, please let me know, okay?
I'll be happy to. I'll be looking for it myself.
All right. Tell folks how they can find you and some of the things you're working on right now.
I am continuing my research onto part of what attracted me to Nicaragua is that it was a long-time site for an interoceanic canal, and that continued until very recently with the Chinese corporation taking an interest in that as well. So to some degree, talking about infrastructure and transportation puts people to sleep. But what my research has shown me is to just how badly that warped Nicaragua's political development, and it's taking us to quite a few of the things that we're talking about here today. So that's the most immediate area where I'm continuing my research right now, and to see if it takes me to the book I'm hoping to come out of it.
Excellent. Well, I think next time you come on, we're gonna have a conversation about that, because I'll have a little bit more opportunity to read some of your work on that, and I think we need to dive into that because it's certainly emblematic of some of the governmental breakdown that's happening in Central America, and why we find ourselves, going through this circular chain of history here. Bad regimes followed by revolution, followed by oppressive regimes, followed by Western-influenced, undemocratic regimes. I mean, there's this rinse, lather, repeat cycle that goes on seemingly in Central American and Latin American politics that can't be ignored. And I think works like that gives us the opportunity for some valuable discussion about that. So I look forward to talking to you in the coming weeks.
Perfect. I look forward to it as well, Pat. Thank you for the time tonight.
All right. He is, in fact, Professor Andrew Hernandez. He is with the Western New Mexico University. He is a teacher of history. He researches current affairs. He studies exhaustively the war on drugs, the influence of American government and their intrusion into foreign affairs, and of course, the quote-unquote immigration crisis that's taking place literally, steps from his home. Thank you so much. We're going to call it a minute or two early tonight. We'll get Joe home on time. We are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn-free, civilly disobedient media, broadcasting live on the Worldwide Coalition Network here at the Go Local Live Broadcast Center. Facebook.com/The Coalition Radio, on the Mighty Mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio, and of course the mothership at CoalitionRadio.us, where links can be found to our podcast page, to our YouTube page, to our new Liberty News page, to our original work. We call it Coalition 1.0, that was held on AM radio for, we're going on 6 or 7 years now. We've kind of lost track. Folks, you have a variety of places that you can spend your Friday evening or listening to a podcast during the week. We're grateful for those who take it here. And of course, we're especially grateful to all of our sponsors. Beacon Shipping and Logistics, 1-855-3-SHIP-IT. BeaconShippingAndLogistics.com. Professional automobile shipping around the world, based here right in Rhode Island. Air Sciences, Derek Gold's feisty organization fighting molds and biological hazards in the home front, in the schools, in your workplace. And of course, the best soda on the planet. You know who I'm talking about. Yacht Club Bottling Works, yachtclubbottlingworks.com. A boutique soda that's been in business over 100 years before we even knew we needed boutique soda. Listen, support those folks and any one of our sponsors. They're all willing to take the time to support controversial third-rail media like this, and we're grateful for them. We'll see you next Friday. Have a great week.